Legion was the last modern expansion which received a lot of positive feedback. But what was so different from Legion when compared to other modern expansions, from Warlords of Draenor all the way to Shadowlands? To start off, let's go over Old WoW. For the purposes of this video, everything from Mist of Pandaria and before will be considered the Old WoW, because Warlords of Draenor is when we got updated models and a lot of systems and gears that we have today. So, modern WoW comprises of 4 expansions: Warlords of Draenor, Legion, Battle for Azeroth, and Shadowlands. And of these 4 expansions, the only one with widespread love was Legion, and 2 of them were considered some of the worst expansions in the game's history. Shadowlands is definitely not on the same level as Warlords of Draenor or Battle for Azeroth, but it's not on the same level as Legion either in reverence. Its biggest praise could be that it's probably average. In Warlords of Draenor, the biggest problem with the expansion was just a lack of content. It had 2 of the best raids in WoW's history, it was probably one of the best leveling experiences in any modern expansion, and included a lot of features that more casual players really enjoyed. The biggest problem with the garrisons was that they were too useful, so that there was never a reason to actually leave them. And with missing a full raid tier, while also having one of the longest content droughts at the end of the expansion, it definitely deserves some of its infamy. Another thing people probably forget about Warlords of Draenor is that it was the expansion which pruned a lot of the old WoW. Warlords of Draenor was when a ton of classes lost abilities. It's also when socket bonuses were just straight up removed from the game, and instead it was added as a tertiary stat. Warforging became more common before they added Titan Forging, and they removed a lot of power from professions and enchants. No longer could you enchant half your gear. They instead restricted it to just a handful of slots. All the professions stopped providing little bonuses to incentivize you being able to pick whatever you wanted, and with the removal of socket bonuses and less enchanting slots, jewel crafting and enchanting were no longer the biggest moneymakers. Warlords of Draenor completely gutted customizations of characters, and it's also when they removed reforging from the game, so they went really hard on not wanting people to mess with their gear that they got from dungeons or raids at all, as they had a philosophy that they wanted you to be able to equip a piece of gear that you just got without having to sim it, or add a whole bunch of extra stuff to it later, like gems, enchants, or profession-specific things, like a tinkering from an engineer, for example. Which is funny because that never actually stopped, and in fact, simming has gotten even more advanced since Mist of Pandaria. But they went a little bit too hard at removing everything, and people were dropping the game left and right, so they did something drastic for Legion, really taking a playbook out of Mist of Pandaria's playbook of just going bombastic with everything. In Legion, they just straight up completely redesigned some specs and classes. The Discipline Priest was changed into a completely unique style of healer, combat rogues were removed from the game and replaced with the Outlaw Rogue, survival hunters were converted into a melee spec, removing the explosive shot hunter from the game, and I'm sure there's many more, but those are the biggest drastic changes I can remember. In addition, they added the first ever infinite power progression. Before Legion, it was technically possible to hit a point where you couldn't really increase the power level of your character anymore. You could get the best gear in the game, and then you were just kind of done, until the next round of expansion content came out. One of the reasons RPG mobile games can be so addicting is because a lot of them don't have power ceilings. I remember one of the browser-based games I used to play, there literally wasn't a max level, but you were restricted in how much you could farm each day due to a stamina bar. So the highest level character was whoever could pay the most money to reset that stamina bar, and it was basically just a whale-off on who could spend the most amount of money. But there is a certain appeal in always being able to progress the power level of your character, or your character in just certain ways that don't always have to be massive jumps, like maybe getting a huge upgrade from a raid drop. So the artifact weapons were kind of this. The artifact weapons did have a cap, but it was so hard to reach that it was almost an infinite power climb. It also provided a lot of really strong bonuses to your class, which we'll go over a little bit later, and they also had a lot of really cool lore things, which really resonated with people, but the biggest gameplay feature of them was the fact that it added a new thing you could farm in-game. In a normal RPG, you're done leveling once you hit max level, so the artifact weapon system essentially added more levels to grind, just replacing the word experience points with artifact power. And someone with a stronger artifact weapon was just stronger than someone else who had a lower level artifact weapon. And while artifact power wasn't very well liked, it does kind of lead into why Legion was so incredibly well liked. And the reasons are pretty simple, and almost directly related to the artifact weapon. Legion is when they released the shackles on players' power, and also when they released the shackles on lore. Warlords of Draenor was the training arc, where you have a whole bunch of weighted clothing and had to lift weights for 2 whole years, and Legion was the moment where Rock Lee drops his weights. adding too much power to gear with gems, enchants, and profession bonuses? How about we add incredibly overpowered legendary effects to equipment? Being too conservative with lore, to the point where you have to go back in time just to experience past events? How about we just bring everyone in the past to the forefront, all at once? The Death Knight campaign directly contributed to Shadowlands' entire plot. One of the first random followers you get in the Priest Order Hall is now looking to be the new leader of the Forsaken. The dagger that Shadow Priests use was a major plot point in BFA. One of the artifact weapons just straight up destroyed a planet. Another one was a fan favorite rumor for years, and was used in all of the promotional materials as one of the weapons you'd be able to wield. And they were powerful too. I made a video on some of the hardest hitting abilities in WoW's history, and a couple of them were just straight up artifact weapon abilities. That's not even mentioning the legendaries. You had stuff like the Mantle of the Master Assassin, which could just straight up give you a 100% crit chance for 6 seconds. Legendaries that gave you extra talents, allowing you to spam use abilities that have cooldowns, or just adding extra buttons or charges to spells and abilities you already had, changing rotation completely. And some of the artifact abilities themselves were so good they were added to the base class after the expansion. In addition to the lore for the weapons and campaigns just being packed full of major, important past characters, we got to go fight the biggest bad guys in the Warcraft universe itself on their home turf, thanks to the help of the Titans, who are some of the biggest, most important good guys we've constantly been hearing about throughout the history of Warcraft lore. You can't really have something that goes more over the top than that. Super powerful weapons, crazy impactful legendaries, lore that was completely over the top, in addition to still having tier set bonuses, the introduction of the Mythic Plus system, and even the widespread love of hard solo content that was the Mage Tower. It was the biggest and brightest expansion we've had in modern WoW, and then it all came crashing to a halt in BFA. Artifact weapons were too strong, so they introduced Azerite, which was like a baby version of it. You could still infinitely grind it out, but the bonuses were minor in comparison to what the artifact weapon provided, and simply just allowed you to use your gear, rather than providing a whole bunch of neat extra benefits. The lore was a lot more small scale too. We went from hanging out with some of the most important people in Warcraft history, to hanging out with some random pirates or trolls that we've never heard of before. There was also no tier set bonuses, no bombastic legendaries. All you were left with was the empty feeling from losing the temporary power-up that was Legion. Although, they can't really have a Legion-like extravaganza every expansion. Wrath of the Lich King was like the Legion of the Classic era. They finally released the restraints they'd been playing under since Classic and TBC, and just went all out with the classes. The first patch of Wrath of the Lich King was probably the most unbalanced the game has ever been, with just how powerful some classes were, including the new Death Knights, who had abilities like a dot which would passively consume hots while they did damage to their target, an AoE which passively feared you if you tried to get out of it, and of course the ability to come back to life if you actually managed to kill them, on top of their 1 minute cooldown 50% damage reduction, or their 5-second immunity to spells. Healing in Wrath of the Lich King was so over the top that they still use it as a benchmark of what they don't want healers to be able to do in the modern era, where the best way to heal was to literally spam your highest mana using abilities non-stop, because your mana was essentially infinite, and mechanics were designed around you having an infinite amount of mana. That's why in Cataclysm, when they gutted all of the Wrath over-the-topness, it wasn't very well received as the previous expansion, because they went a little bit too hard in the other direction. Mists of Pandaria was them going back to that. Mists is when pretty much every class could do everything. It was the culmination of classes getting new abilities with every expansion for 5 expansions, without them ever removing abilities from the previous expansions. There were so many new abilities that classes had that just accumulated over time, that everyone could do pretty much everything. Every class had some kind of major DPS cooldown, some kind of form of crowd control, some gap closer, some snare, a raid cooldown, and if by chance you were missing something, a druid could just symbiosis you to gain whatever you might be lacking, as the tables for what symbiosis could do was more in-depth and probably designed than the entire conduit system. Mists of Pandaria wasn't very well liked at the time, but it is definitely another over-the-top expansion when it comes to player power, which is why they had to remove so much of it in Warlords of Draenor. So World of Warcraft kind of has a system where they go all out with one expansion and then completely reel it back in with the very next expansion for the long-term health of the game. If they never had the ability pruning in WoD and just kept adding new baseline abilities with every new expansion, then every class would be completely homogenized by now. You could basically play whatever you wanted and be good at everything. Now, that style of gameplay definitely has its own appeal, but it does make things kind of hard to balance when every class has 100 different abilities. So, after having a bombastic expansion in Legion, they then reined things in hard with BFA. It seems like they were ready to have another overpowered expansion afterwards. Since, here's how it seems like it was going. Wrath was the overpowered expansion to culminate early Classic WoW, to then have the cooldown in Cataclysm, with it ramping back up again in Mists of Pandaria, then a cooldown in Warlords of Draenor, and then going full throttle in Legion. So, going by that pattern, Shadowlands should have been the bombastic new expansion, going all out, except they didn't really go far enough. Shadowlands definitely tried to go for big lore moments, but they definitely did not attempt to go for big player power moments. And even the lore isn't as grand as it was in Wrath of the Lich King, Mists of Pandaria, or Legion. Wrath of the Lich King is probably #1 favorite when it comes to players' final boss. Mists of Pandaria added so much lore to the game, it's probably the most influential lore expansion ever added. As well as, we still deal with things that happened in Mists of Pandaria in the modern era. And Legion, of course, had us fighting the Legion and Titans with planet-destroying weapons and spaceships. BFA was a nice breather of an expansion. Shadowlands should have been even crazier than Legion, with everyone going to the afterlife. Instead, it's a lot more tame, and they're trying to play things a little bit too safe. Although it's still only the first half of the expansion, so who knows, it could go off the rails later, probably not though. But that does allow us to go straight back into the original point of the video. Why was Legion the best expansion of modern WoW? Because it was the last expansion where players got to be overpowered, and the lore was completely off the rails. The next 2 expansions afterwards were too balanced and too on the rails, even though current WoW is literally in the afterlife. However, because they've had 2 expansions in a row where players were kind of on the rails, that leads them to easily allowing another Legion-like expansion afterwards. Although we really should have been in it right now with Shadowlands.